a Navajo elder, broke a sacred oath for me, an oath older than this country, older than the language I'm speaking right now. He broke it, and his family turned their backs on him. His community shut him out. The men he'd prayed with for 60 years stopped speaking to him entirely. He died alone in a kitchen in Vallecito, New Mexico, 3 days before anyone found him. And the thing that keeps me awake at night, 30 years later, the thing that makes me reach for the inhaler on my nightstand at 3 in the morning when my scarred lungs won't pull enough air, is that he did it for me. A white veterinarian from Las Cruces who had no business being that deep into those mountains. Leonard Sosi sacrificed everything, and I need to tell you why. But first, you need to understand something. What I found in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in 1993 was not what I went looking for. I went looking for an animal, something with claws, something that was cutting up cattle on a ranch outside Penasco. What I found instead was something that looked at me with eyes full of intelligence and made a decision about who I was. And that decision changed everything: my career, my marriage, my understanding of what lives in the wilderness of this country when no one is watching. My name is Harold Meyer. People call me Hal. I'm 78 years old. I spent 41 years as a large animal veterinarian in northern New Mexico. Cattle ranches, horse operations, goat herds and sheep flocks spread across Rio Arriba and Taos counties. I've sutured wounds on 1,200-pound bulls in the middle of lightning storms. I've pulled calves at 3 in the morning in 9-degree weather. I've had my arm shoulder deep inside a mare's birth canal, trying to turn a foal that didn't want to come into the world. I have seen things that would make most people sick, but nothing in 4 decades of veterinary medicine prepared me for what I found in those mountains. And nothing prepared me for what it cost. Not just me. Leonard, my wife Carol, everyone who got close to the truth. My lungs are failing. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. The tissue is turning to scar slowly, irreversibly. No cure. Every breath I take is a little harder than the one before it. My pulmonologist in Albuquerque gives me maybe 2 years before I need oxygen full-time. After that, the window closes fast. So I'm telling this now, while I still have the air in my chest to get the words out. Carol never heard this story. My wife of 43 years. She died in October of 2019. A massive stroke in her sleep. She went to her grave never knowing what happened to me in those mountains. That is the single greatest regret of my life. Not the encounter, not the fear. The fact that I carried this secret through our entire marriage and never trusted the woman I loved most in this world enough to share it with her. She deserved the truth. It's too late to give it to her. So I'm giving it to you instead. Now, let me tell you where I come from, because it matters. My grandparents on my father's side came over from Bavaria in 1921, settled in the Rio Grande Valley, because someone told my grandfather the soil was good for farming. Turned out to be only partially true. But the Mayas have been in New Mexico for over 100 years now. 3 generations working this land. And if there's one thing my family understood, it was this: you respect what the land gives you. You don't ask questions about what it keeps. My grandmother used to say it in German. Frag nicht, was der Berg behält. Don't ask what the mountain keeps. I thought it was just old Bavarian superstition, the kind of thing farm people say to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. I was wrong. I was wrong about a lot of things. I graduated from Colorado State's veterinary program in 1974. Came straight back to New Mexico because the state needed large animal vets badly. Ranches in Rio Arriba County hadn't seen a veterinarian in 3 years. I set up my practice in Espanola. Within 6 months, I had more work than I could handle. I drove a beat-up Ford F-250 with a camper shell full of medical supplies. 400 miles a week, minimum, running between ranches. My territory stretched from south of Santa Fe, all the way up past Taos, and east into the Sangre de Cristos, where the ranches got smaller, more isolated, harder to reach. That eastern edge, where the high desert gives way to the mountains and the ponderosa forests start thick and dark. That's where this story begins. And it began the way most things in my life began, with a sick animal. September of 1993. I was 45 years old, 20 years into my practice. Manny Quintana called me out to his ranch, 60 head of cattle on rough terrain, backing up against the Carson National Forest boundary, 14 miles east of Penasco, at the end of a dirt road that climbed into the foothills. Good man, Manny. Hard worker. But his voice on the phone was different that morning. Tight. Uncertain. He said 3 of his cows had come in from the upper pasture, with injuries he couldn't explain. Deep lacerations, shoulders and flanks, not barbed wire, not predator marks. Nothing he recognized. Now here's what you need to understand. Manny Quintana had been ranching that land since he was 16. His father before him, his grandfather before that. He knew every predator, every hazard, every seasonal pattern that piece of country could throw at him. And he was scared. I left Española before dawn, drove north through the valley with the Sangre de Cristos turning pink in the sunrise. Turned east past Penasco. The last 5 miles were unpaved, rutted, climbing steadily. By the time I pulled up to his gate, I was at 7,800 feet elevation. The air had that thin, clean bite you only get in the mountains in early fall. Manny met me at the corral. He looked worried, and when he showed me those cows, I understood why. 3 parallel cuts, deep enough to expose the subcutaneous fat layer, running diagonally across the left shoulder of each animal. The spacing between cuts was consistent, 3¼ inches apart, and the edges were clean, not torn, not ragged the way a bear swipe leaves them. Clean, like a scalpel had done it. Except no scalpel I'd ever held could cut that deep through cowhide in a single pass. I cleaned the wounds, sutured them, gave each cow a shot of penicillin, and I stood in that corral trying to make it make sense. Bear was the obvious answer, but it was wrong. Black bear claws leave ragged tears, not clean parallel incisions. Mountain lion was wrong too. Cats slash and grab. They don't leave symmetrical marks across 3 separate animals. I asked Manny about tracks. He shook his head, but then he said something that I didn't think much of at the time. Something I've thought about every single day since. He said his grandfather used to talk about something in those mountains, something the Pueblo people and the Dene, the Navajo, had known about long before any Spanish settlers arrived. Something big, something that walked on 2 legs, something that left marks on the animals it chose not to kill. I want you to hold on to that phrase, chose not to kill, because that distinction is going to matter a lot. I drove home with 3 blood samples in my cooler and a feeling in my gut I couldn't name. Those cuts weren't defensive wounds. They weren't feeding injuries. They were precise, deliberate, identical across 3 separate animals. Something with extraordinary manual dexterity and significant strength had made those marks intentionally. 2 weeks later, Manny called again. 2 more cows, same marks. Right flank, this time instead of left shoulder. Same 3 parallel incisions. Same spacing, same surgical precision. I drove out, treated the animals, and this time I told Manny I needed to see the upper pasture, where the cattle were when it happened. He didn't want to take me up there. I could see it in his face, a reluctance that went beyond the practical, but I had a professional obligation. I told him as much. We saddled horses and rode up the mountain. The upper pasture sat about 2 miles above the ranch house, a long meadow in a natural bowl between 2 ridge lines, surrounded on 3 sides by dense ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. Beautiful country, the kind of place that makes you understand why people fight over land. We found where the cattle had been grazing. I got off my horse and started looking. And within 10 minutes, I found something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Tracks, pressed deep into the soft earth near a seasonal creek bed. A line of them leading from the tree line, crossing the meadow, disappearing back into the forest on the opposite side. Bipedal, 2 feet, left, right, walking stride measuring just over 5 feet between prints. Each footprint approximately 17 inches long, 7 inches wide. I'd measured thousands of tracks in my career. Hoof prints, paw prints, boot prints. I'd studied animal locomotion in veterinary school. I knew what I was looking at, and I knew that nothing in the zoological record of North America could make a bipedal footprint that size. I knelt beside one print and put my hand inside it for scale. My entire hand, fingers spread wide, fit inside with room to spare. The depth suggested a weight of at least 500 pounds. I looked up at Manny. He was still on his horse, hadn't come closer. He was watching me with an expression I can only describe as confirmation, like he'd known what I would find. "Manny," I said, "what makes a track like this?" He was quiet for a long time. Wind came through the meadow and bent the grass in waves. A Steller's jay screamed up in the tree line. Then silence. "You should talk to Leonard Sosi," Manny said. "He's Dene, lives over by Valecitos. He knows about this." "Knows about what?" Manny looked at the tracks, then the tree line, then back at me. "About what lives up here, about why the old people don't come to this part of the mountain anymore." Now, I almost didn't follow up. I want to be honest about that. I was a scientist by training and temperament. My grandfather may have been a Bavarian farmer with superstitions about mountains, but I was a Colorado State graduate with a DVM and a practice built on evidence-based medicine, blood counts, bacterial cultures, radiographs, not local legends about things in the mountains, but those tracks wouldn't leave me alone. I went back to my office and pulled every reference I had on North American mammalian fauna, measured bear tracks in field guides, cross-referenced stride length with body mass estimates, ran the numbers every way I could. Nothing fit. The closest match was a large black bear walking bipedally. They do that occasionally. But the stride length was wrong. The foot morphology was wrong. Bears don't leave tracks with a clear arch and distinct toe impressions. Whatever walked through that meadow walked upright as its primary mode of locomotion. And it was enormous. 3 days later, I drove to Valecitos. Small community, maybe 200 people strung along the Rio Valecitos. I stopped at the post office, asked about Leonard Sosi. The woman behind the counter, Barbara, told me he lived 4 miles south on the river road. She also told me he probably wouldn't talk to me. I found his place easily. Modest adobe house, green metal roof, set back behind cottonwoods, vegetable garden on the south side, well tended. Older Chevy pickup in the driveway. A dog of indeterminate breed on the porch that raised its head when I pulled in, but didn't bark. I knocked. Leonard Sosi opened the door after about 2 minutes. Early 70s, lean, deep brown skin, silver white hair pulled back from his face. His eyes were dark and sharp, and they assessed me completely in the time it took me to say my name. I told him who I was, that Manny sent me, that I was investigating livestock injuries and tracks in the upper pasture. Leonard listened without expression. When I finished, he said 2 words. "You're the animal doctor." I said I was. He looked past me at my truck, at the veterinary supply boxes visible through the camper shell. Then he looked at me again. Manny shouldn't have sent you to me. But he opened the door wider, and he stepped aside to let me in. What happened next in that kitchen, what Leonard Sosi told me across 3 hours and 2 pots of coffee, would break an oath that had been kept for generations. But before I tell you what he said, I need you to understand something about the man who said it. Because what it cost him is the part of this story that still wakes me up at night. His house was spare and clean. Wood stove in the corner, kitchen table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and ceremonial objects I knew enough not to ask about. He poured coffee without asking if I wanted any, and for the first 10 minutes, he didn't answer my questions. He asked his own, about my practice, how long I'd been in New Mexico, my family, my wife, where my grandparents came from. He was measuring me, deciding if I was worth the risk of whatever he was about to say. I answered everything honestly. I told him about Carol, about our 2 boys, about the Meyer family's 100 years in the valley. I told him my grandmother's saying about the mountain. He smiled at that. First real expression I'd seen on his face. Your grandmother, he said, was smarter than you. Then he got quiet, refilled his coffee and mine, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, lower, more careful, like a man picking his way across a frozen river, testing each step before committing his weight. What I'm about to tell you, Leonard said, I'm not supposed to tell. Not to anyone who isn't in A. Even among my own people, this knowledge is held by very few. We don't speak of it casually. And the reason is not that we're superstitious. The reason is that some knowledge is dangerous. Not dangerous like a gun, dangerous like a door. Once you open it, you can't close it again. And what comes through changes everything on both sides. Something shifted in that room. The light hadn't changed. The coffee was still warm in my hands. But something had become serious in a way that went beyond conversation. The tracks you found, he said, the marks on those cattle, they come from something my people have known about for a very long time. Longer than your grandmother's family has been in Bavaria. Longer than the Spanish have been in this valley. We have a name for them, but I won't say it here because saying the name has power. What I will tell you is this. They are not animals. They are not human. They are something else. Something that was here before any of us. And they have their own laws, their own territory, and their own understanding of the world that has nothing to do with ours. I asked what they looked like. He closed his eyes. I could see him wrestling with something inside himself, a boundary he was approaching that he knew he shouldn't cross. When he opened his eyes, the decision was already made. They stand upright, taller than any man, covered in hair, dark, thick. Their faces are not like ours, but they're not like an ape's either. Something in between, something that looks at you and you know, in your body, not your mind, that it is thinking, that it is deciding something about you. He paused. I could hear the clock on his wall ticking. My grandfather showed me one when I was 14 years old, 3 days on horseback into the Yemes Mountains, a place with no name on any map. He showed me, and he told me what our family's responsibility was, to know, to watch, to keep the boundary between their world and ours, to never tell outsiders, because the moment outsiders know, they come with their guns and their cameras and their arrogance. They try to capture what cannot be captured. He looked at me. People always die. Now here's where I need you to pay close attention, because what Leonard told me next explains the cattle, the tracks, and the thing that was about to happen to me in those mountains. The marks on Manny's cattle were not attacks. They were messages, territory markers. The creatures were telling whoever used that pasture that a boundary had been crossed, that the cattle were grazing too far into their range, and that the next communication would not be as gentle. Leonard's grandfather had seen the same marks on sheep in the 1930s, near Counselor on the eastern edge of the Navajo Nation. Same 3 parallel cuts, same precision, same spacing. His grandfather's uncle moved the sheep to lower pasture. The marks stopped. 5 generations of Sosi men had carried this knowledge, each one sworn to silence, each one watching the boundary. Leonard was the last. No sons. 2 daughters who'd married and moved to Albuquerque and Flagstaff. Neither wanted anything to do with what they considered their father's old-fashioned beliefs. The knowledge was going to die with him. That's part of why he told me. Not because I was special. Not because I deserved it. Because he was 72 years old, and the truth was heavy, and he was tired of carrying it alone. He told me to go home. Told me to tell Manny to move the cattle to lower pasture. Told me to forget what I'd seen. He said this with the intensity of a man who was not theorizing. He was warning me from generations of experience. I nodded. I thanked him. I drove home. I told myself I would do exactly what he said. I lasted 11 days. The problem was that I was a scientist. I don't say that as an excuse. I say it as a diagnosis. The part of my brain that got me through veterinary school, that built a practice on observation and evidence and differential diagnosis, that part would not let go. Those tracks were real. Those lacerations were real. 17-inch footprints pressed 2 inches into soil, my own boots barely dented. Whatever made them was a large bipedal primate that was not supposed to exist in North America. And every cell in my scientific brain was screaming that this was the most significant zoological discovery in modern history. The arrogance of that thinking is clear to me now, at 78, sitting in this chair with lungs turning to stone. But at 45, I was still young enough to believe that knowing was always better than not knowing. Leonard tried to tell me otherwise. He broke a sacred oath to warn me, and I ignored his warning completely. October 14th, 1993. I told Carol I had a ranch called Past Penasco that would keep me overnight. Not entirely a lie. I did stop at Manny's ranch, checked his cattle. Then I told Manny I was going back to the upper pasture. He looked at me the way Carol sometimes did when I was being stubborn. That mix of affection and exasperation the people who love us reserve for our worst decisions. You talked to Leonard. I did. And you're going up there anyway. I just want to see the tracks, take measurements, photographs. I'll be back before dark. Manny shook his head. You won't be back before dark. Nobody who goes up there looking for them comes back before dark, because they don't come out during the day. He was right. I rode up. Spent 3 hours photographing tracks, making plaster casts, and by the time I finished, the sun was behind the western ridge and the light had gone from gold to gray. The smart thing was to pack up and ride down. But the tracks led north, deeper into the forest, and the scientist in me, that relentless, curious, arrogant part, wanted to see where they went. I tied the horse at the meadow's edge, took my flashlight and my veterinary bag, which had a large bore syringe of ketamine and a hunting knife in it, and I followed the tracks into the trees. The forest closed around me like a mouth. That's not a metaphor. Old-growth ponderosas, some of them 4 feet across. Their canopy blocked what was left of the daylight. So completely I was using my flashlight within 50 yards. The tracks were clear in the soft duff. They followed the creek drainage, climbing gradually, winding between massive trunks. I followed them for 45 minutes, maybe a mile. The tracks never deviated from the creek. Whatever made them knew this route intimately. Then they stopped, not gradually, not as if the creature had turned onto rocky ground. They just ended, mid-stride, as if the thing had been walking and then ceased to exist. I stood there in the dark, flashlight beam on the last print, and I felt something I had never felt before. Not fear exactly, something more fundamental. The awareness that I was not alone, that whatever was with me was watching from a position of absolute advantage, and that it had been watching for some time. I turned off my flashlight, I don't know why. Instinct, the same instinct that tells a prey animal to freeze. I stood in the dark and let my eyes adjust, and in that blackness, no moon, stars hidden by canopy, I could see almost nothing, but I could hear something breathing, not the quick, shallow breath of a deer, deep, slow, deliberate, the breathing of a large mammal at rest, close, 15 feet, maybe 20. Somewhere to my left, uphill, in a dense stand of young spruce, I stood completely still. I'm not a brave man. I want to be clear about that. My greatest act of physical courage before that night was reaching into the birth canal of a breech-presenting mare to turn a foal, but something held me there. Not courage, curiosity. The same curiosity Leonard had warned me about, the same curiosity that, in his tradition, was not a virtue. It was a vulnerability, a door that couldn't be closed. The breathing shifted. Whatever was in those spruce trees moved, branch snap, significant weight, and then I heard something that made my body go rigid, a vocalization, low, rumbling, deep in a massive chest cavity, somewhere between the grunt of a bear and the moan of a whale. Imagine that sound 15 feet away in total darkness. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then a second vocalization, higher pitch, behind me, other side of the creek. I was between them, at least 2. I turned my flashlight back on. My hand was shaking so badly, the beam looked like a strobe. I swept it toward the spruce thicket, and I saw movement, a shape, enormous, dark, pulling back deeper into the trees. I caught a fragment in the light, a shoulder, covered in dense, dark brown hair, almost black, at least 2 feet across, at a height that put the top of the creature's head somewhere around 8 feet off the ground. I moved the light, and for one fraction of a second, a quarter second, I caught the reflection of 2 eyes, not the green eye shine of a deer, not the amber of a cat. These eyes reflected a deep reddish gold, set in a face that was wide, flat-featured, heavy-browed, and unmistakably looking directly at me, not with the blank stare of an animal caught in light, with the focused, evaluating gaze of something making a decision. Then it dropped below the beam so fast I lost it completely. It moved through the brush uphill, not running, not crashing, moving with a fluidity and quiet that something that size should not have been capable of. The one behind me crossed the creek, water splashing under its weight. Then silence. I stood there for 5 full minutes before my legs worked. Then I went back to the horse, rode down to the ranch in the dark, sat in my truck in Manny's driveway for an hour before I was steady enough to drive, got home at 2 in the morning. Carol was asleep. I sat at the kitchen table in the house where I'd raised my boys and paid my mortgage and lived a normal life. And I put my head in my hands and I cried, not from fear. Though there was fear, I cried because I understood exactly what Leonard Sosi had been trying to tell me. Some doors don't close, and I had just walked through one. So here's the question you should be asking. If that encounter terrified me, and it did, down to my bones, why did I go back? Why did I go back 11 times over the next 7 months? I'll tell you why, but you won't like the answer, because the answer isn't about courage, it's about compulsion. I was a rational man with a wife who loved me, a practice that needed me, 2 teenage boys who thought I was the most boring person on earth, which is exactly what teenage boys should think about their fathers. Every reason in the world to stay in Española, and I went back 11 times, each time telling Carol I had ranch calls, each time driving up past Peñasco and hiking into that forest. I brought better equipment, 35mm camera with a telephoto lens, portable tape recorder, plaster casting kits, a notebook where I recorded everything with clinical precision. Date, time, weather conditions, temperature, tracks observed, vocalizations heard, scat collected. I was conducting a field study. I was also being drawn in, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. The third trip, late October. At the spot where the tracks had ended during my first encounter, I found something that changed everything. A pile of stones, 5 of them, stacked deliberately, largest on the bottom, smallest on top, in a location where no natural process could have placed them. Next to the stones, a dead rabbit, freshly killed, neck broken cleanly, not eaten, placed. I'd seen enough predator behavior to know the difference between a cached meal and a deliberate placement. This rabbit had been put here, next to these stacked stones, for someone to find, for me to find. I photographed everything, measured the stones, noted the rabbit's species, approximate age, cause of death, and then I did something I can't fully explain. Call it scientific method, call it intuition, call it the same reckless curiosity Leonard warned me about. I left an apple from my lunch and a piece of jerky on the largest stone, hiked back to the meadow, waited until dark, heard nothing, came back 4 days later. Apple and jerky gone. In their place, a single large pine cone and a strip of bark peeled from a tree and folded into a rough shape. I picked up the bark, turned it over. It had been manipulated deliberately, folded, creased, shaped by fingers that understood the concept of creating an object. Not a tool, an offering, a response to my offering. I was communicating with something, and it was communicating back. By January of 1994, I had established what I can only call a relationship. Every 4 or 5 days, I hiked to the spot, left an offering, returned to find it taken, and something left in exchange: pine cones, stones, feathers, strips of bark shaped into forms I couldn't always interpret, but that were clearly intentional. Once, a bone, deer femur, cracked open for marrow, with one end carved into a rough point, not with a knife, with teeth marks and pressure that suggested the bone had been modified by biting and grinding. I kept everything. I have a metal lockbox in my garage that Carol never found. 37 objects, each one labeled with the date, location, and conditions of collection, each one representing a moment of contact between 2 species that were never supposed to communicate. And with each exchange, the creature came closer. Not suddenly, not aggressively, incrementally. The way a wild animal learns to trust a human who has demonstrated consistent, non-threatening behavior. Except I wasn't the one controlling the habituation. It was. February. I could hear it breathing from 10 feet. March. I could see it at the edge of the spruce thicket in the last grey light of dusk. Standing full height, approximately 8 feet 4 inches, broad through the chest and shoulders, arms hanging to mid-thigh, hair dense, dark brown, with reddish highlights catching the light. Its face, not simian, not human, something between. Heavy brow ridge, wide flat nose, a mouth capable of expressions I recognized. It could frown. It could open its lips in what might have been a smile, though the teeth behind those lips made the expression deeply unsettling. And its eyes, deep-set, dark, reflecting reddish gold in low light, filled with an intelligence I can't describe without sounding like a man who's lost his mind. But I haven't lost my mind. I've held on to it with both hands for 30 years. Those eyes looked at me the way a person looks at you, with consideration, with judgment, with recognition. It knew me, and it had decided I was safe. That is a decision. That is cognition, And what happened next would prove just how deep that cognition went. April 7th, 1994. I hiked up, carrying my usual offerings. Apples, jerky, a can of sardines the creature had developed a particular fondness for. Warm weather for early spring. Snow melted early. Creek running high and fast. I reached the exchange spot, and I knew immediately something was wrong. The stones I'd stacked the week before were scattered, crowned, torn up. Not tracks, signs of a struggle. Broken branches, gouges in tree bark, deep furrows in the duff. Something heavy dragged, and hair. Tufts of dark brown hair caught in the bark of a ponderosa at 7 feet off the ground. I followed the drag marks upstream, 200 yards, and there, in a depression beside the water, I found it. The creature, lying on its side, alive but hurt, a wound on its left side, below the rib cage. My professional instinct kicked in before my conscious mind caught up. 6 inches long, deep, inflicted by something sharp. Not claws, something smooth-edged, straight. A blade. Someone had stabbed this creature. It looked at me. Those reddish gold eyes, glazed with pain but still aware, still recognizing me. It made a sound, not the deep vocalization I'd heard before. Softer, breathy, almost a sigh. And it moved one massive hand, the hand closest to me, and laid it palm up on the ground. I am a veterinarian. When an animal is injured and shows you its vulnerability, when it lies still and lets you approach, when it turns its body to give you access to the wound, that animal is asking for help. In 41 years of practice, I have never refused an animal that asked for help. I knelt down next to a creature that weighed at least 500 pounds and could have crushed my skull with one hand. I opened my veterinary bag, and I went to work. The wound was deep but had missed the vital organs. Whoever did this had struck from slightly behind. The creature had been turning away when the blade connected. Bleeding significant, but not arterial. I cleaned the wound with betadine solution. The creature flinched, gripped a root system with its free hand, hard enough that I heard wood crack, but it did not pull away. 14 stitches. Same technique I used on livestock. Large curved needle, heavy gauge suture material, interrupted stitches for drainage. And the creature watched me work, breathing labored but steady. Twice it made that soft, breathy sound, and once, it moved its free hand and touched my forearm, with fingers that were rough, calloused, startlingly warm. The touch lasted about 2 seconds. It was gentle, deliberately gentle, the kind of controlled pressure that requires fine motor skill and conscious regulation of force. This creature, in the middle of being sutured without anesthesia, was being careful not to hurt me. When I finished, I sat back on my heels, and I looked at what I had done. I had performed veterinary surgery on a Sasquatch. I had sutured a stab wound on a creature that every biologist in the world would tell, you cannot exist. And that creature had lain still and let me do it, because it trusted me. Something cracked inside my chest. Not my lungs, not yet. That would come later. Something else. Some wall I'd built between the rational world I lived in and the impossible world I'd just entered. It came down in that moment. It never went back up. I sat next to the creature until dark, then 3 more hours after that, listening to its breathing steady and slow. And at some point, I started talking to it. Not because I thought it understood English, because I was a man sitting alone in the dark next to something that defied everything I thought I knew, and I needed to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. I told it about Carol, about my boys, about growing up in the valley, about my grandmother's saying. I told it things I'd never told anyone, because who was it going to tell? And it listened. I swear to you, on everything I have left in this world. It listened. I went back to Leonard. I had to. I drove to his house on a Saturday morning in late April. When he opened the door and saw my face, he knew. Didn't even ask. Stepped aside, poured coffee, sat down and waited. I told him everything, the exchanges, the habituation, the stab wound, the surgery, the touch on my forearm. Leonard listened with his eyes closed, hands wrapped around his coffee mug. When I finished, the silence in his kitchen was the thickest silence I have ever sat inside. Then he opened his eyes and said something I will carry into whatever comes after this life. You have been chosen, and you don't even know what that means. Now I need to tell you what that meant, because it changes everything about this story. Leonard told me that among the Dene, there were stories, old stories, about the creatures choosing individual humans. He called them bridgewalkers, people who moved between the human world and the creature world, a point of contact, a channel through which two species could coexist without conflict. His grandfather had been one, and his grandfather's father before him. The Sosi family had served as bridgewalkers for generations, part guardianship, part diplomacy, part something that didn't translate into English, a spiritual obligation beyond any Western concept of stewardship. And now, one of them had chosen me, a Bilagena, a white man, a veterinarian from Española, with no cultural framework, no ancestral knowledge, no spiritual preparation. He said this without anger, but with a sorrow I felt in my chest. You have to decide, Leonard told me, whether you're going to accept what's being offered or walk away. But you should know that walking away now will be harder than it was before. Once they choose you, they don't forget. They'll wait for you, they'll watch for you, and if you don't come back, they'll mourn. He paused. These creatures mourn, Hal. They grieve. I've seen it. I asked about the stab wound. Who did it? His face changed. Sorrow deepened into controlled fury. Hunters, men who come into these mountains every year looking for them. Guns and knives and trail cameras. Men who want a body, a specimen, proof. He spat the word. They think these creatures are animals, trophies. They have no idea what they're dealing with. He told me about incidents stretching back decades. Hunters who went into the high country and never came out. Search parties finding campsites torn apart. Equipment destroyed. No bodies. A man in the 1970s who shot one with a high-powered rifle, found 3 days later, alive but catatonic, sitting against a tree 10 miles from his camp with no memory of how he got there. The creatures didn't kill unless they had to, but they could. And when the boundary was violated with violence, the response was swift, overwhelming, and designed to ensure it never happened again. The one you treated, Leonard said, leaning forward. It's old, very old, older than me, older than my grandfather when he showed me my first one. It's been in those mountains for a very long time. And it chose you. That's not an accident. It watched you for months, tested you, showed you its wound, and let you touch it. He locked eyes with me. It's telling you it's tired. It's been doing this alone for too long. The bridgewalkers in my family, we knew how to communicate. The protocols, the boundaries, the ceremonies. You don't know any of that, but it chose you anyway, because you're the only one who came without a gun. You came with medicine. You came to heal. He paused. Cottonwood leaves rustling outside. Then he said the words that sealed his fate. That's why I'm going to help you, even though it will cost me everything I have left. And it did. Leonard Sosi began teaching me. Not the sacred knowledge, not the ceremonies, not the things that belong to the Dene and could never be shared, but the practical knowledge. How to approach, how to behave, how to read the signs, the vocalizations, the gifts, the territorial markers. He met me at the trailhead below Manny's ranch twice a month through the spring and summer of 1994. and he took me into those mountains and showed me things that no textbook, no field guide, no wildlife documentary had ever come close to describing. The creature, the one I had treated, was there almost every time. It emerged from the forest at dusk, always from the same direction, always stopping at the same distance, until Leonard made a sound, a low humming vocalization from his diaphragm rather than his throat. Then it would come closer. It was healing well. My sutures had held. The wound was closing cleanly. By June, the scar was a pale line against the dark hair of its flank. Extraordinary immune system, extraordinary tissue repair. Leonard showed me how it communicated. The vocalizations were more complex than I'd imagined. Low-frequency rumbles carrying emotional content. The way a growl carries threat, a purr carries contentment. Higher sounds that seemed to function as identifiers. Names, almost, and occasionally, rarely, a sound so close to a human word that the hair on my arms stood up every time I heard it. It never spoke English. I want to be clear. It didn't speak language in any human sense, but it produced sounds with consistent meaning, used in consistent contexts, and Leonard could interpret them with a fluency that told me he'd been doing this his entire life. He was graceful with the creature, respectful, and it responded with familiarity, like meeting an old friend who speaks a language you barely know, but whose company you value beyond words. But word got out. That's the thing about small communities. Manny Quintana knew, his wife knew, Barbara at the post office knew the white vet visited Leonard regularly. People talk. People in rural New Mexico talk the way people everywhere talk. Not maliciously, just persistently. By midsummer, Leonard's visits with me had become a subject of discussion through the Navajo community around Vallechitos, and someone told Leonard's family what he was doing. I will never forget the day he told me. August of 1994, we'd just come down from the mountain after an extraordinary session. Over 4 hours, the creature had brought a second individual to the clearing, smaller, not juvenile, but younger. Perhaps female, though I couldn't determine sex from external observation. The two had stood at the tree line together. The older one made a series of vocalizations while looking between us and the newcomer. The unmistakable impression was introduction. The creature was presenting us to a member of its family. Our acceptance was being evaluated. One of the most extraordinary moments of my life. And then we walked down, and Leonard sat on the tailgate of his truck and destroyed me. His sister's family had stopped speaking to him. His nephew Raymond, active in tribal government, confronted him at a family gathering, accused him of betraying the Diné by sharing sacred knowledge with a white man. The elders asked him to appear before them. He went. He didn't lie. He told them he had taught a Bilagena about the creatures, that the creatures themselves had initiated contact by choosing me. It didn't matter. The oath was the oath. The knowledge was the knowledge. It belonged to the Diné, and Leonard had given it away. He wasn't formally banished. That's not how Navajo communities typically handle things. But the result was the same. Family withdrew. Neighbors became distant. People he'd known his entire life. Weddings, funerals, ceremonies attended for 7 decades. They turned away. Not with anger, necessarily. With something worse. Disappointment. The quiet, devastating disappointment of a community that trusted one of its own with something sacred and watched him give it to an outsider. Leonard told me all of this in a flat, measured voice. Sitting on his tailgate, hands on his knees, looking at the mountains. When he finished, I said the only thing I could think of. I said I was sorry. I said I'd stop coming, leave the mountains, never go back. Tell his family it was over. Leonard looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked old. Not elderly. He'd always been elderly, Old, the way a mountain looks old, worn down but still standing, still holding what it holds. It's too late for that. The creature chose you. You can't unchose yourself. I can't untell what I've told. All I can do is make sure you know enough to do this right. He paused, then said something I hear in my sleep. My grandfather told me something when I was 14. He said the hardest part of being a bridgewalker is that you stand between two worlds and belong fully to neither. He was right. But he didn't tell me the second hardest part. What's the second hardest part? Watching someone you care about step onto the bridge for the first time and knowing they'll never be able to step back off. He wasn't talking about me. He was talking about himself. About the moment he opened his door to a white veterinarian and chose to break an oath that had been kept for generations. He did it knowing the cost. And the cost was everything. I continued going into the mountains alone after that. Without Leonard, his presence only made things worse for him. But we stayed in contact. Every 2 or 3 weeks, I drove to his house, sat at his kitchen table, reported what I'd seen. He interpreted, explained, corrected, still teaching, still carrying the obligation, even as the consequences mounted. By fall of 1994, his sister's entire family had cut him off. By winter, he'd stopped attending community events entirely. By spring of 1995, he was essentially alone. An elderly Navajo man on the river road, talking to a white veterinarian about creatures the rest of the world said didn't exist. And I couldn't help him. That's the part that still wakes me at 3 a.m, coughing, lungs rattling with the sound of tissue hardening into something that cannot exchange oxygen. I couldn't help Leonard because the thing that hurt him was the thing he'd done for me. I couldn't undo it, couldn't make his family forgive him, couldn't give back the knowledge. All I could do was keep going into those mountains and try to be worthy of what it had cost. Over 3 years, 1994 to 1997, my relationship with the creature deepened in ways I still struggle to articulate. I called him the old man because that's what he was. Leonard had told me the creature was ancient, and as the months passed, I came to understand what he meant. The old man moved through those mountains with the confidence of something that had been there longer than the trees. He knew every trail, every water source, every sheltered spot and vantage point. He knew where the elk herded in winter and where the bears denned in November. He knew the mountain the way I knew my own practice, and he knew me. The sound of my footsteps, the sound of my truck on the road below, my schedule, appearing within an hour of my arrival as if he'd been waiting. Once, winter of 1995, I arrived late because of a difficult carving, expected to wait hours. The old man was already there, sitting at the base of a ponderosa. When I emerged from the tree line, he turned his head and made a sound that Leonard later told me was the vocalization equivalent of recognition. He was saying my name, his version of it, the thing that meant me in whatever system he used to organize his world. I learned his preferences. Sardines and apples, consistent favorites. A surprising fondness for peanut butter I discovered by accident when I dropped a sandwich. I learned his moods by frequency and tone of vocalizations. I learned his territory. Approximately 15 square miles. I learned he shared it with at least 4 others. The younger one, the female, I came to believe, appeared regularly by summer of 1995, 7 feet tall, lighter color, reddish-brown, smaller, more refined features, warier, slower to approach. But over time, she too accepted me. The old man remained largely unchanged through all of this. While I aged, while my knees stiffened, and my hair thinned, and the first whispers of what would become my diagnosis began somewhere deep in my lungs, the old man stayed powerful, imposing. A new scar here, perhaps slightly deeper set eyes, but fundamentally the same ancient, magnificent creature I had treated in a creek bed. His agelessness beside my aging became its own kind of heartbreak. Then the threat came. And what happened next is the reason I'm telling you this story. October 1996. Manny Quintana called on a Tuesday evening, voice tight, controlled. He told me a group of men had set up camp on Forest Service land about 2 miles west of his upper pasture. 4 men, expensive equipment, trail cameras, thermal imaging gear, rifles. They told Manny they were elk hunters, but Manny had been around hunters his whole life. These men weren't hunting elk. They were methodical, setting up observation posts, and they were asking questions. In town, at the gas station in Peñasco, at the feed store in Taos, about unusual animal activity in the Sangre de Cristos, big tracks, strange sounds at night. Someone had talked, whether a rancher who'd seen tracks, a hiker who'd heard vocalizations, or someone in Leonard's community sharing information as punishment. I never found out. But these men were here because they'd heard something, and they were looking for exactly what I'd been visiting for 3 years. I called Leonard. He was quiet a long time. Then he said something that settled into my bones. This is what my grandfather warned about. This is what the oath was meant to prevent. He told me I needed to go up the mountain, warn the old man. He said it without irony, without hesitation, as if telling a veterinarian to hike into the wilderness and communicate a threat to a Sasquatch was the most natural instruction in the world. By that point in my life, it was. I went the next morning, cold October day, aspens on the lower slopes blazing yellow and orange, air sharp and thin. I reached the clearing by mid-afternoon, waited. The old man came at dusk, as always, emerging from the spruce thicket with that slow, deliberate gait I knew as well as my own walk. He stopped at his usual distance, made the recognition sound. Then I did something I had never done. I walked toward him. Not slowly, not cautiously, directly, the way you walk towards someone you need to tell something urgent. He watched me come. Body language shifted, slight tension in the shoulders, weight repositioning, the readiness of a creature that survived decades by being prepared for anything. But he didn't move away. I stopped 6 feet from him, closest I'd ever been. I could smell him, thick, musky, not unpleasant, earthy and animal and layered with the forest, pine resin, creek water, turned earth. I could see the scar on his left side. My sutures, 2.5 years healed, a pale ridge barely visible through dark hair. And I could see his eyes, those deep reddish gold eyes, looking down at me from 8 feet, with concern. He knew something was wrong. Read it in my body language, my pace, my breathing. The same way I could read distress in a horse by the set of its ears and the tension in its neck. I pointed down the mountain, toward the west, toward the hunter's camp. I made a gesture I hoped communicated danger. And then I did something Leonard had taught me, something from the Diné tradition, the oldest form of communication between bridgewalkers and the creatures. I placed my right hand flat against my chest, over my heart, and I extended it toward the old man, palm open. Leonard had told me this gesture meant protection, guardianship. I will stand between you and harm. The old man looked at my hand, looked at my face, still for 10 seconds, which does not sound long, but when you're standing 6 feet from a 500-pound primate in the fading light of an October evening, it feels like eternity. Then he did something that broke me entirely. He raised his own hand, that massive, rough, dark-skinned hand with fingers thick as my wrist, placed it against his chest and extended it toward me, palm open, the same gesture, returned. He was telling me the protection went both ways. Whatever I was warning him about, he was also standing between me and harm. I cried, standing there in the cold October dusk, 6 feet from a creature science says cannot exist. I wept like a child, not from fear, not from awe, though there was awe, from the weight of understanding that this being, this ancient, impossible, magnificent being, valued me, that in whatever framework of consciousness it operated within, I mattered to it the way it had come to matter to me, and that the world would never know, that I could never tell Carol, never tell my boys, never tell my colleagues or my friends, because no one would believe me, and because telling would bring more hunters, more cameras, more men with rifles and thermal imaging who wanted to prove what I had already proven to myself beyond any doubt. The old man waited while I collected myself, patient, still. When I finally wiped my eyes, he made a new sound, one I hadn't heard before, a low, resonant hum that vibrated in my chest cavity. I felt it in my sternum and my spine. 5 seconds, and then he turned, walked back into the trees, moving up the mountain, away from the clearing, away from the creek drainage, away from the direction I had pointed. He understood. He was moving his territory away from the threat. I stood in the clearing until I couldn't hear him anymore. Then I sat on the cold ground and let the dark come. And I thought about Leonard Sosi, who broke a sacred oath so that this moment could happen, so that a white veterinarian could stand in a forest and tell an ancient creature that danger was coming. The cost, whether it was worth it. I still don't have an answer. The hunters stayed 3 weeks. I monitored from a distance, drove past their access road, talked to Manny, listened for gunshots that never came. They found tracks, according to Manny, found scat, found tree structures, branches woven in patterns that couldn't be explained by wind or animal behavior. Got very excited, but they never found what they were looking for. The old man had moved, taken the female and his group higher, steeper terrain, far more difficult for humans to access. The hunters left in early November, frustrated, empty-handed. I waited 2 more weeks, hiked back to the clearing, empty. Exchange spot undisturbed. No stones, no offerings, no signs of presence. I left sardines and apples. Waited. He came back in December, tracks in fresh snow, leading from the upper ridge down to the creek and back. He'd come to check, to see if the danger had passed. I left more offerings, returned 3 days later. Sardines gone. In their place, a stone. Just a stone, same size and shape as the first stone he'd ever left me, over 2 years earlier. I understood it as clearly as if he'd written a letter. I'm here. We're safe. Thank you. I held that stone by the creek, and I thought about Carol, home in Española, thinking I was checking on a pregnant mare near Angel Fire. I thought about my boys, teenagers consumed with their own lives. No idea their father spent Thursday evenings sitting in a forest talking to something impossible. I felt the distance between the life I lived and the life my family thought I lived. A physical weight, a pressure on my chest that had nothing to do with the pulmonary fibrosis that wouldn't be diagnosed for another 23 years. A secret eating me alive. And the only person who understood was Leonard Sosi, who the secret had eaten alive too. Now, I need to tell you about the last time I saw the old man, March of 2002, 9 years. 9 years of Thursday evenings and Saturday mornings. 9 years of offerings and exchanges. 9 years of watching an ancient creature navigate a world closing in around him. Forest Service had built new trails. Mountain bikers discovered the upper meadows. A housing development went in on the lower slopes near Peñasco. Construction noise carrying up the mountain on still days. The old man's territory had shrunk. Not dramatically, Not in a single event, steadily, incrementally, the way a man's lungs lose capacity when fibrosis turns tissue to scar. A little less range each year, a little less space, a little less room to be what he was. By 2002, I was 54. Practice thriving. Boys in college. Carol and I had settled into the comfortable routine of a long marriage, finishing each other's sentences, arguing about the same three things we'd argued about for 20 years, loving each other in that deep, quiet way that doesn't make for exciting stories, but makes for a good life. And every Thursday I drove into the mountains. But that March evening, something was different. I felt it at the clearing, heavy electric quality in the air, like the moment before a storm. Though the sky was clear, the forest was silent. Not normal evening quiet. Deep, complete silence. The kind Leonard said signaled the presence of something the forest itself was paying attention to. The old man was already there. Not at the tree line. In the clearing, in the open, in the last full light of day. He had never done that before, standing in the center of the meadow, fully upright, facing me, and not alone. The female behind him, behind her, at the edge of the spruce thicket, two more shapes, large, dark, motionless against the trees, 4 of them. I had never seen more than 2 at once. He watched me cross the meadow. When I was 20 feet out, he made a vocalization I'd never heard. Long, complex, tonal shifts rising and falling over 10 seconds. Not directed at me, directed at the others. The female came forward. The 2 at the tree line came forward. They formed a semicircle, with me in the center. I should have been terrified. 4 Sasquatch, the smallest 1.5 feet taller than me, standing in a semicircle around a 54-year-old veterinarian at sunset. But I wasn't afraid. I felt what I imagine a person feels when they're admitted into a family. When the door opens and the people inside make room. And you understand the room was always there, waiting for you. The only thing keeping you out was time. The old man stepped closer. Closer than ever before, close enough to feel heat radiating from his body, hear the air moving through his enormous lungs, smell the forest on his hair. He reached down, slowly, that same controlled gentleness from the surgery, and he placed his hand on the top of my head. His palm covered my entire skull. Fingers curled past my ears. The weight was immense, but the pressure was light, feather light. He held it there, looking down at me with those reddish cold eyes, and the look in those eyes. I will spend whatever time I have left trying to find the right word for it. It wasn't love, not in the human sense. It was something older, something that predated language, culture. Whatever divergence sent his kind one direction and mine another. Recognition, not just of me as an individual, recognition of me as a being, something alive, conscious, worthy of acknowledgement. The same recognition I had given him when I knelt beside his wound and chose to heal instead of run. He was giving it back. Then he removed his hand, turned, made a short, low vocalization. The others turned with him, and they walked into the forest, all 4, that impossible silent grace, massive bodies flowing between trees like water through stones. The old man was last. At the tree line, he paused, turned his head, looked back at me over his shoulder. One last look, and then he was gone. I went back every Thursday for 6 months. He never came. Offerings left untaken, vocalizations unanswered. I searched for tracks, hiked ridgelines and creek drainages I'd never explored. Found nothing. The mountain was just a mountain again. Leonard Sosi died in November of 2004. Heart attack. Alone in his kitchen in Vallechitos. 3 days before anyone found him. 7 people at his funeral. 7. A man who'd lived 74 years in his community. who'd served as a bridge between two species for his entire adult life, who broke an oath not from selfishness, but from desperate need to make sure the knowledge survived. 7 people came to bury him. His 2 daughters, Barbara from the post office, Manny Quintana, and his wife. A cousin from Farmington who hadn't spoken to Leonard in years but came out of obligation. And me, the white veterinarian who cost Leonard everything. I stood at that grave in the thin November sun, looked at the mountains, and made a promise, not to Leonard, he was beyond promises, to myself, that someday, when I had nothing left to lose, I would tell this story. Not all the sacred knowledge. Some of that I will never share. But the fact of the sacrifice, the fact that a Navajo elder broke a generational oath to save a man who didn't deserve saving, that his tribe never forgave him, that he died alone in a kitchen in Vallejitos because of it. I should tell you what happened after that. Carol and I grew old together, sold the house in Españoli, moved to a smaller place outside Taos. I continued my practice until 68, retired when my knees and back told me it was time. We traveled, watched the boys settle into their own lives, had grandchildren, 30 good years after the mountains. And every single day, I carried the weight of what I knew and could never share. Carol knew something was different about me. She wasn't a fool. You don't live with someone 43 years without noticing they carry something heavy they won't put down, she asked, a few times, usually late at night, usually after wine. Hal, what happened to you up there in the mountains? Something happened. I've always known it. And I lied. Every time, stress, work, isolation of rural practice, anything except the truth. Because if I told her, she'd look at me differently. She'd wonder about my sanity. The life we'd built together, normal, good, quiet, would crumble under the weight of the impossible. So I kept it. And she died without knowing. The stroke took her in her sleep. Tuesday night, October 2019. I woke Wednesday morning next to my wife of 43 years, and she was gone. The first thing I felt after the shock, after the grief, after the bottomless howling emptiness of realizing the person who knew me best was no longer in the world, the first thing I felt was regret. She should have known. She earned the right, and I was too afraid to give it to her. My grandmother was right about the mountain. Frag nicht, was der Berg behält. But she was wrong about the reason. It's not that the mountain punishes you for asking. It's that once you know the answer, you can never unknow it. And the distance between what you know and what you can share becomes the loneliest place on earth. I'm 78 years old. My lungs are turning to stone. 2 years, maybe less. Before every breath requires a machine, no wife, no sacred oath, no community standing, nothing left to lose. So I'm telling you, there is something in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico. Something tall, something old, something that walks on 2 legs and thinks with a mind that is not human, but is not less than human either. I treated its wounds. I sat with it in the dark. I watched it show me a kindness that most humans are not capable of, and it watched me grow old in a way that it apparently does not. Leonard Sosi died so that I could know this. His family turned away. His community shut him out. He spent his last years alone, and he did all of that because he believed the truth mattered more than the oath. I'm not sure he was right. I'm not sure the truth mattered at all. Not to anyone except me, and Leonard, and the old man. But I promised myself I would tell it, and now I have. If this story stays with you, if it makes you wonder about what else walks in those mountains when no one is watching, then I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who might listen. Not because I need validation, because Leonard deserved to be heard, because the old man deserved to be known, and because some secrets are too heavy for one man to carry into the ground. Be safe out there. Respect the wilderness. And if you ever find tracks that don't match anything in the field guides, if you ever hear a vocalization in the dark that sounds like language but isn't, if you ever look into a pair of eyes that reflect gold in the failing light and see something looking back that understands exactly what you are, do what I should have done. Don't run. Don't reach for a gun. Reach for whatever part of you still remembers how to be humble in the presence of something greater than yourself. That's what they're waiting for. That's what they've always been waiting for.